Glute training for a round and thick butt. We have three muscles on the glute. We have the glute minimus, which sits on the side of your hip. We have the glute medius, which is a little bit more to the back. And we have the glute maximus, which is the biggest part of your glutes. If you want to have a thick and round butt, the glute maximus is the muscle you want to go for. Like being said, it makes up the biggest part of your glutes and it's also the strongest extensor of your hip. But not only the glutes extend at the hip, the hamstrings, these muscles do as well. So when it comes to glute training, you want to make sure that it's the glute maximus, which is actually doing the work of extending the hip and not the hamstrings. So how do we get this done? Both the hamstrings and the glutes extend at the hip, and it's actually not possible to isolate one of those muscle groups. Both muscle groups will simultaneously extend at the hip, but it's just the percentage of how much which muscle group works, which you can influence. So it's either 70% that your glutes are working and 30% your hamstrings are working, or it's 70% your hamstrings are working and 30% your glutes are working. These numbers are fictional, but it shows you the difference of the activation of each muscle group. And now I'm going to give you 2 tips on how to improve the activation of the glutes for your glute training. Several studies have shown that if you stretch the antagonists, so the muscles on the opposing side of the ones you want to train, that you will have a higher activation of the agonist muscle in your working sets. So what does that mean? If you stretch the hip flexors, especially the quads, which have shown to make a significant difference here, then you will have a higher activation when you train your glutes. This is the type of stretch I would recommend to do before your working sets, when you do RDLs, hip thrusts, or whatever exercise you're trying to do when you're training your glutes. And generally, when it comes to strength training, I wouldn't recommend to do static stretching before your workout. But when it comes to stretching your antagonists, it actually doesn't make a difference. This stretch you can do static, but I would recommend to do it in a dynamic way, like rotating to the right and leaning a little bit back while always having a contraction on your glute. Or if you want to have a bilateral stretch to save some time, this one is the one I would recommend. You can also change this static stretch into a dynamic stretch by leaning backwards and getting upright again. The second tip I can give you is for any exercise you're doing with your foot on the ground, like Bulgarian split squats, for example. Like you learned in the beginning of the video, you have 3 glute muscles, 2 of them sitting more on the side of your hip. And if this happens on your foot, then you will have a higher activation of the muscles on the outside of the hip, the glute minius and the glute medius, which you actually don't want to train if you want to have a thick and round butt. So avoid your foot planting on the outside. What's important when it comes to any glute exercise you're doing with your foot on the ground is to push your big toe, the ball of the foot, into the ground. This gives you a higher activation of the glute muscle, the glute maximus muscle, the big muscle which you actually want to train to have a thick and round butt. And with these 2 recommendations, you will maximize the output you get from your glute training. Thank you for looking into this video. If you have any questions, please send me a message or leave me a comment. I will be very happy to answer them. See you in the next video.